world was once a vastly different place. To experience this won't hurt you, and there is nothing to fear. This video will continue our exploration of the ancient Mother Goddess, whose first appearance we have traced back to prehistoric times. It seems that with the emergence of the more advanced civilizations, including the monumental cultures of Egypt and Mesopotamia, the primeval goddess faded into the background and often disappeared altogether. In the prehistoric epoch, there are no written histories to guide us, but there are abundant figurines suggesting a mysterious feminine form with certain unique features. In this earliest phase, we cannot say whether regional wars were commonplace or largely absent. Hunting weapons seem more obvious than preparations for battle. We see little or no evidence of the warrior kings that appeared so forcefully with the emergence of the great civilizations that followed. Unsettled issues include the origins and meaning of sacrifice and details concerning death and burial. Nevertheless, based on the totality of evidence explored in this series, a variety of conclusions can be drawn as to the prehistoric environment from which the first images of a mother goddess emerged. For context, our approach to the mother goddess draws upon a larger investigation into the wide-ranging cross-cultural archetypes of the antique world. These most fundamental structures of ancient thought, at the dawn of civilization, invite us to work backward in time to envision a world before historical chronicles and before systematic timekeeping. That means prior to the first appearance of what we've called the polar configuration, a grand assembly of planets gathered close to Earth and moving through a dusty plasma cloud. Our claim has been that it was this polar configuration, by its impact on human imagination, that catalyzed the emergence of symbols and sacred practices that defined early civilizations. And so, one puzzle drawing our attention is the dramatic break that appears to separate the prehistoric phase from the subsequent emergence of developed languages and commemorative practices. It seems that this gap largely excludes the evidential linkage or chain of events that one might have hoped to follow across the divide from prehistoric to historical evidence, and yet several tantalizing clues invite us to ask new questions. Across the prehistoric period, we observe two evolutionary phases in the emergence of a mother goddess image. Both are explicable, but only within the framework of a radical challenge to common thinking. The earliest evidence includes a first female form that historians and archaeologists still struggle to understand, a distinctly rotund goddess type called Stereotypia. As we should expect, there is a frequent and inexplicable suggestion of sphericity in the prominent features of the primitive goddess. And we're not surprised that the spherical head or face of the goddess often appears featureless, or that the lower limbs are frequently presented as a tapering column, exactly as we've seen in our review of the Martian contribution to the polar configuration. For us, this places an exclamation point to an inescapable conclusion throughout these investigations, that something unrelated to any human cause provoked the extraordinary depictions of the mythic gods. In the emergence of the prehistoric goddess idea, there was a second phase as well. That phase involved a distinctive torus or enclosure, displaying a visual opening and closing as the celestial bodies moved through space. This effect can be compared to the variable positions we previously observed in the symbolic arms wrapped around the margins of the enclosure and appearing in competing positions above and below the breasts of the goddess. In fact, the changing visual plane of the torus adds additional clarity to that ancient concept. And for us, that means a new chapter in this investigation, a chapter we could not have written just a year ago. A critical breakthrough comes from an anciently depicted, clearly toroidal womb of goddess figures where no human attribute will explain the unique form presented. The ring displayed by this Olmec goddess is a useful starting point, and it is not unique. Even more striking is the Moshe counterpart many centuries earlier, in which the torus is sufficiently clear to identify that form as the archetype, whereby the associated female figure simply gives the context of the mythic interpretation. Ironically, it's another example from the opposite side of the world that offers the most striking counterpart to the South American goddess images. In this case, not only supporting a radically new interpretation of the goddess, but confirming the direct connection to the visual opening and closing of the envisioned torus. We refer here to the enigmatic images of the mythic figure named Sheela-na-gig. Her widely distributed images, appropriately called grotesques, are found across much of Europe, most prominently in Ireland, and enigmatically most often placed close to the entrances to churches. The general consensus is that they had a protective function, similar to that of the Medusa head placed above temple entrances in other parts of the world. But beyond that agreement, scholars are still looking for an explanation of the deeply entrenched idea. In the case of Sheela-na-gig, the connection to the visual opening and closing of a torus is simply too strong to be disputed, as we see most emphatically in these examples from Ireland, and most notably in the instance shown here, where the toroidal form stands out as nothing else than a torus seen from a position orthogonal to the plane of the torus itself, and thus in the fully open position visually. What then was the relationship of the opening and closing of the Sheela-na-gig torus to the eye mask form also displayed by this very figure? That's a form with which we are already familiar, and the answer comes from the ancient habit of juxtaposing alternative mythic interpretations of underlying archetypal forms. In this instance, the question has already been answered by our earlier analysis of the polar configuration, where the twin eyes of the eye mask image are explained by the unique forms of electric discharge in the plasma laboratory, as we learned from the leading plasma scientist Anthony Peratt over a dozen years ago. Seen from the edge-on vantage point, the observer looked directly into the twin aspects on opposite sides of the tubular torus itself. As viewers who followed our presentations will remember, in the famous stickman image so frequently seen carved on stone globally, twin dots on opposite sides of the figure resulted from a field of view directly into the tubular plasma discharge form. But now there is more to consider, since the visual opening and closing of the torus would affect both the symbolism of the twin eyes and the toroidal void so frequently and enigmatically enclosed by the twin arms of the ancient goddess. Both the twin eyes and the toroidal folded arms direct our attention back to distinctive aspects of the root forms. Eyes closed, or eyes fully open with a direct view into the tubular torus that constituted the visual boundary of the enclosure, to which we add the tapering lower limbs of the goddess as the formation evolved. Our claim is that the full complex of symbolic patterns belongs to a unified substructure tracing back to prehistoric times. And lastly, it's not just in the ancient images and not just in laboratory experiments that we observe the twin aspects of the plasma torus. Today we see similar geometry in the toroidal form configured around the south pole of the planet Venus. Though obviously diminished and degraded as planets moved around the sun in increasing isolation, The original dynamics of the primitive goddess archetype can still be discerned, and that's a synchronicity well worth investigating. One polar vortex producing twin vortices, just as our study of the eye mask revealed, and just as laboratory experiments have so conclusively demonstrated, and now just as we have observed in the prehistoric mother goddess. Such considerations as these can only add crucial support for an extraordinary human experience, confirming once again that the ancient world was indeed a very different place.